This video lecture is on Nietzsche's third essay on the Genealogy of Morals. What is the meaning of ascetic ideals? So Nietzsche is interested in the ideal that underlies, that motivates ascetic practices, and specifically thinking of philosophy and moral philosophy in particular as an ascetic practice, as promoting an ascetic ideal. So ascetic ideals, they basically celebrate some form of self-control, self-mastery of the body by the intellect or by the spirit, by the opposite or the negation of the body, the immaterial, if it is the intellect, the mind as non-material, or of course the soul. So ascetic ideals, they motivate, right? In one sense, by ideal we mean that which towards we aspire, that maybe which normatively justifies what we do, what we think we ought to do. But asceticism then is this kind of doing away with bodily things, particularly or usually, right? Pleasure, but any other kind of worldly things or worldly aspirations one might have. So it's a kind of ridding oneself of those worldly desires, those worldly actions, a worldly life. When we ask what is the meaning of ascetic ideals, Nietzsche considers three different main areas or professions, I guess, or disciplines that promote ascetic ideals by artists. So artists, he thinks, promote ascetic ideals. He says, well, they really mean a whole lot of things. And artists, when they promote, right, maybe when they paint, sculpt, whatever, or the poet, right, writes about ascetic ideals, typically Nietzsche thinks it's not that there's something that really underlies the artist or what it means to be an artist that necessarily is asceticism, but rather when artists promote ascetic ideals, they're really just in some way reflecting society. So it's a reflection maybe of the zeitgeist or something like that, which is why there can be so many different things that are meant by ascetic ideals by the artist. And I'm actually not going to focus that much on specifically the artists and the ascetic ideals of the artists that Nietzsche talks about in this video. By philosophers, they mean, he says, by the most favorable preconditions of higher spirituality. And by of higher spirituality, kind of, right, the highest, most consistent, universal conditions of truth, of logic, of being as that which is not particularized. So philosophers, right, they ultimately aim at truth, but they mean truth in some kind of typically consistent way that's like over and above life itself, that we use to carve up and make sense of life. And when he uses higher spirituality, he does so even if you have philosophers that are atheistic or they're not making religious arguments. He still, as we're going to see, thinks of it as a kind of spirituality that motivates philosophy ultimately by aspiring to ascetic ideals. And then there's also religious priests. And priests, Nietzsche says, what they mean by ascetic ideals, they mean it by their instrument of power. Really going back to the first essay here, that we can identify the ascetic ideal of the priest with a kind of ressentiment, a kind of way to not promote oneself in one's way of life, not to secure it, but rather to get rid of other forms of life which challenge one's own, the life of the priest. So that's why you'll find that what's interesting here is the priest isn't just one who advocates asceticism, but it's a kind of totalizing advocation of all of existence, and as such, not just you don't just have the practices, the normative practices of the priest that the priest wants to aspire to. It is a certain kind of totalizing normativity of all of existence itself. And it's that kind of asceticism and that advocation of the ascetic ideal that is an instrument of power, as we'll see Nietzsche argue. So the purpose of what he wants to argue, why he's writing this third essay, it's not to give a causal account of, the origin of ascetic ideals, what makes ascetic ideals possible in that kind of a sense. It's not like a history. So it's not to bring to light what the ascetic ideal has done throughout history, how it has operated, but rather what it means, what it indicates. And I think most revealing, he says, the purpose of this essay is to bring to light what lies hidden beneath the ascetic ideal. What is presupposed by the ascetic ideal? That which those people or disciplines, institutions that promote ascetic ideals, what is it that really motivates, that really drives the ascetic ideals unconsciously, such that the one advocating the ascetic ideal isn't even aware that this is necessarily what they're doing? And as we'll see, Nietzsche is going to identify the problem of the ascetic ideal, he says, is that it's meant so many things to man. However, because the ascetic ideal has meant so many things to man, it's an expression of the basic fact of the human will. It's horror vacui, or horror of a vacuum, of a lack. Of a lack of what? Well, the ascetic ideal, because it's so pervasive throughout humanity, in the arts, philosophy, religion, and even, as we'll see later on, science. The ascetic ideal means so many things, is a basic fact of the human will, because it is a reflection of this being terrified of a lack of necessary, transcendent, objective meaning of existence. And this means that the ascetic ideal, it needs a goal. The human will needs a goal that it proposes in the form of an ascetic ideal. And the human will, it would rather will nothingness than not will. That when it finds there is no objective meaning, it would rather will there be nothing, the world not exist. It would rather, in a sense, negate the world, negate existence, than to not will, not to have a drive, a motivation for anything in the world, because there is no objective meaning for it. So nihilism ultimately underlies the ascetic ideal, as we'll see. So Nietzsche says that ascetic priests consider everyday life to be misguided, right? They find that those who are concerned with pleasure, those who are concerned with certain ideals or certain social norms, maybe that I need to have a high-paying job, maybe that I need to get married, maybe that I need to do whatever else, play sports, watch sports, any of these kinds of things that are concerned with the world. The ascetic priest considers this misguided, right? The world is really just an illusion. And what they say is, well, because the world is an illusion, there aren't these really necessary things that one must do in order to live. There's nothing in the world that says that, well, the life of a football player objectively is meaningful or anything like that, right? Because that doesn't exist, because then everyday life is misguided, they enforce their attitude, the ascetic attitude of a negation then of the world, a rejection of this meaninglessness, by forcing it on others. In turn, that justifies then their own beliefs. That it's not that they, by themselves, live a certain way within the world, but they enforce that kind of attitude on the world itself in order to justify, to give meaning, or an attempt to give meaning to their own existence, in this existence as a negation of existence, which is what asceticism is, a negation of worldly physical things. Now, the ascetic priest, Nietzsche says, because they're so focused on contemplation. Historically, those who are involved in contemplation, those who withdraw from the world, was seen as suspicious, right? The powerful are going to know, well, why are you not participating in society, what we all kind of just take as normal, yet you're doing kind of something else? Is this a threat to my existence, right? The powerful are going to think. And so already then, just in the way that ascetic practices, and specifically then the ascetic priest, exists as a social role, right, necessarily is interrelated with others, the ascetic priest has to secure their own existence as an ascetic priest. They have to secure their own ascetic practices. And this is why they must enforce those attitudes on others, by renouncing the world, not, in their own attitudes, but the world must renounce the world. Right, think of the proselytizing nature, which is, most, I think, famous in Christianity, of course, Islam as well. Nietzsche says that the ascetic ideal is most tangibly realized in Christianity, or the practices, the ideal of the ascetic priest is most tangibly realized in Christianity, specifically because we can find the Christian values of, poverty, chastity, humility, a kind of absolute love for the other, in a way that kind of makes everyone equal. We don't love anyone more than anyone else. We love everyone equally, such that there are no differences, right? Same thing with poverty. There are no differences. The material differences, sexual differences, whatever, right? That kind of equaling of the playing field that represents the values of Christianity. That is a kind of asceticism that is an ascetic ideal, because the world is not equal. There are differences in the world. There are bad things in the world. There are good things in the world. And those kinds of values of Christianity wants to say, well, they don't matter. They're ultimately an illusion, right? Everyone is equal in the eyes of God. Now, the ascetic priest is important because, one, they have these ascetic practices. They're the first ones to really withdraw from society. Two, they live by contemplation. And three, they then represent this kind of resentment of the worldly values that then motivates the kind of will to power of the ascetic priest. And so philosophers, Nietzsche says, originally appeared priestly, right? Originally the priests were, in a sense, kind of philosophers, by giving or trying to invoke a certain kind of meaning, or, on the other hand, trying to argue the meaninglessness of the world. And so Nietzsche says, the peculiar withdrawn attitude of the philosopher, world-denying, hostile to life, suspicious of the senses, freed from sensuality. For the longest time, philosophy would not have been possible at all on earth without ascetic wraps and cloak, without an ascetic self-misunderstanding. Because the philosopher doesn't see themselves as the priest. The philosopher wants to go beyond and say, well, I'm not just, or at least especially the Western philosopher, I'm not just a religious person. I kind of go beyond that, and I'm interested with truth itself. Now, truth of religion, truth of God, but truth of existence itself. And so the philosopher wants to say, I am not like the priest, right? I'm interested in the transcendent value of truth itself, not just, the kind of religious practices that a priest is interested in. And yet we can already see from this quote here, Nietzsche is identifying all the ways that what the philosopher really is interested in, how they think of truth, which is their ultimate motivation, right? Philosophy comes from the Greek philo and sophia, love of wisdom, but a kind of loveless, a non-sexual love, love for the sake of truth. We pursue truth for the sake of truth, not for the sake of anything else in the world. And not just the kind of ideal that the philosopher is interested in, but most often the kind of life that a philosopher lives is kind of world denying, right? Just like the priest, they're kind of hidden away from the rest of society, in their office, in books, odd people that live differently, in a way where they say, all that, what everyone else does, how everyone else lives, they're all kind of ignorant, right? They live a life of illusion. But the philosopher knows by pursuing truth. The philosopher, by pursuing a kind of truth that is transcendent over and above the world, right? That is the kind of ideal the philosopher advocates. And we can see this in looking at the way that philosophers approach aesthetics. Not all philosophers, of course, approach aesthetics the same, but we can find, according to Nietzsche, kind of what exemplifies most the philosophical attitude towards aesthetics in Kant and Schopenhauer and their equation of beauty as a kind of truth. So, aesthetics is concerned with beauty. What is the beautiful? What makes possible beautiful things? Why do we find certain things to be beautiful? Knowledge is concerned with truth, right? We say that we have knowledge of something if in some way it corresponds to the facts that actually are, to what is actually true. And that kind of truth that knowledge is a reflection or a representation or corresponds to is a kind of impersonal truth. It's not of any one. It is not particular in the sense that, well, it's true for a certain practice for a certain time. It is timeless, so it's a permanent kind of truth. And it's universal. It applies in all places, to all people, over and above the world. So in a way, it's a kind of the opposite of the world, which the world is very personal, very particular in all of its differences and nuances. The world is impermanent. Things are always a matter of becoming in the world, coming into being and dying, decaying. And the world is not, one single thing in space and time. So, in the case of Kant, right? Kant considered beauty from, Nietzsche says, from the impersonal point of view of the spectator, rather than the artistic point of view of the creator, the way that an artist is going to reflect or bring to life a certain perspective of maybe how society views things, of how the artist views things. But the philosopher, like Kant, in considering beauty from an impersonal point of view, is going to be interested not in why do we find the painting beautiful? Why is the painting beautiful? That which is beautiful, according to Kant, is that which gives us pleasure without interest. That which gives us pleasure without interest. Is that how we typically, when we find a painting or a sculpture or a poem to be beautiful, is it that we're uninterested in the thing and we kind of have this Platonic identification of beauty with the object? Or how about Schopenhauer, the philosopher Schopenhauer, who described one effect of the beautiful as the calming effect it has on the will? Is that how, when we actually find things beautiful, when I find my wife to be beautiful, is it the case that it's a kind of calming effect on the will in the way that we think of the kind of blandness of truth? Or do we find things beautiful in a way that involves excitement, that involves interest or passion? And it's not just, Kant and Schopenhauer. Philosophers in this way, they've always been irritated at sensuality. We can see in the Stoics, who don't, want to be moved, want to be able to control their emotions. In Buddhism, which very similarly wants to not hold on to emotions, not hold on to things, recognize the world is ultimately empty. There is no self. Deontology in the case of Kant, right? Deontological ethics doesn't take into account emotion at all. Any bodily concerns. Utilitarianism is interesting because it says, well, what matters the most is, what increases pleasure, but they think about it again from a kind of impersonal point of view. What increases pleasure for the greatest number of people, such that it's not, does it make me happy? It's, does it make the greatest number of people happy, which isn't any one individual. It can be the greatest number of people happy over, a period of 1,000, 10,000, all of existence. Who actually is being made happy by that normative principle? So what then is the ascetic ideal of a philosopher? We've seen that philosophers typically think about aesthetics, right, a beauty, a desire, in this kind of impersonal way, wanting to identify that which is truly beautiful with kind of the same characteristics of truth. And we can identify then in asceticism a rejection then of sensuality, a rejection of the body. And so already then, even that thing which we might think of the beautiful as being associated with the body, being associated with sensuality, with experience, the philosopher kind of wants to desensitize beauty. What exactly is motivating the philosopher? What is the ascetic ideal of the philosopher? And when we're asking what is the meaning of the ascetic ideal, right? What does the philosopher mean by the ideal which motivates them? We're asking really, what is the value of the ascetic ideal? Why might it be valuable? And, well, what determines what value is according to the philosopher? And that's going to make us think about the question of what is the ascetic ideal, or what is the meaning of the ascetic ideal, differently. Because again, we're not interested in a kind of causal account of, or maybe even like the methodology of the philosopher. We're not going to say, well, the problem is the way that philosophers do philosophy, right? They need to do it a different way. Or there are better and worse means of doing philosophy. That's not the kind of question Nietzsche is interested in. He's interested in the way that ascetic ideals, they have a certain hierarchy of value, of that which we desire, that which we're motivated by. What does it mean to be motivated by? So, what is the value of the ascetic ideal that the philosopher places in, and this is important, right? Again, we don't want to ask it in the way that the philosopher asks, from an impersonal, transcendent, perspective, the view from nowhere. We want to ask it in the way as we ask things that actually occur in life, right? We don't ask, when someone is feeling sad, we don't want to ask them, well, why is sadness? We want to ask, why are you sad, right? What is your perspective in being sad? And we want to ask then the philosopher, right? What is the value that the ascetic ideal that the philosopher places in their life? We want to personalize the ascetic ideal. And we want to then ask, because the philosopher takes that ideal to be universal, to apply to everyone, what is the value of the ascetic ideal that the philosopher places in our life? Nietzsche says the philosopher sees in it an optimum condition for the highest and boldest spirituality, and smiles. He does not deny existence. He rather affirms his existence and only his existence. The philosopher affirms, the existence of the philosopher. And think about how, in the Republic, who is it that rules in the ideal city Callipolis? It's the philosopher king. In Aristotle's Ethics, now, what is the good life? It's the life of contemplation. It's not non-philosophical lives. Nietzsche says, every animal, therefore le bête philosophe too, the philosophical animal, that philosophers are animals as well, every animal instinctively strives for an optimum of favorable conditions under which it can expend all its strength and achieve its maximal feeling of power. We want to think about this as philosophy is a kind of practice that, just like any other human being or any other kind of animal, engages in. And why do animals engage in these things? For self-preservation. We want to think about when the philosopher thinks of truth in this way. We want to say, well, we don't want to psychologize it in the way that we want to say, well, these kind of norms that philosophers have, they're natural, right? That would be to basically mistake the effect for the cause. Or did I get that backwards? Mistake the cause for the effect. We want to rather see what the philosopher is motivated by unconsciously. And so he says, I'm not speaking of its path to happiness, of the philosopher's path to happiness, but its path to power, to action, to the most powerful activity, and in most cases, actually, its path to unhappiness. The philosopher thinks that by pursuing truth for the sake of truth, it makes them happy. But we'll see there's actually a contradiction here. So we can take the ascetic values of the philosopher to be universal, permanent, and impersonal, as opposed to particular, becoming, and perspectival. All of those things that are worldly. One example I think we can see this in is in the case of the political philosophical idea of utopia. What political philosophers, what first motivates them is the question of what is justice, right? In an ideal sense, what is the ideal city? What is the best possible form of government, right? They think of utopia as opposed to politics. They're not interested in the actual nitty-gritty, the kind of dirtiness, the messiness, the conflict of politics. They're interested in a sense, what is a state of government that doesn't involve politics? So even in that case, right, we can see the way that what the philosopher is motivated by, being a kind of ascetic ideal, when it engages in political philosophy, it's going to take the phenomenon of politics and its kind of instability, its kind of power, conflict, and it's going to depoliticize it. The ascetic ideal that the philosopher is interested in is a will to nothingness. It is a kind of nihilism, Nietzsche argues. What the philosopher is involved in is bad conscience, a form of irreparable guilt directed backward, in that the issue that the philosopher identifies with the world, right, in the case of, with a political philosopher, we can take again with utopia and politics, well, the problem is the fact that not everybody agrees. People have different values, different religious values, cultural values, moral values. There are disputes that have to do with maybe scarce resources and things like that. And the issue is in humans themselves, right? Their kind of maybe selfishness, the world itself, because of the instability it's due to as well, part of the emotions and the body. The issue then is with the philosopher as being a human being, as wanting to not be a human being, because the problem is that messiness. But you can't not be a human being. And so the philosopher is motivated not by a responsibility to politics, but a kind of responsibility to this guilt of really original sin that's been, philosophized. And you can't overcome that original sin. That's what it is. It's necessarily something you're born with. Now, one might ask, but what about the feeling of sinfulness? The fact that people really do feel guilty in this way, that they can't overcome that guilt, that they've done something so bad they can never be forgiven for it. They can never pay back the harm that they've done. Well, Nietzsche says, and again, kind of, I wouldn't say psychologizing, but wanting to look at how it's maybe a kind of pathology. He says, sinfulness is not a fact, but merely an interpretation of a fact of physical depression. That someone feels guilty or sinful is no proof that they're right that they're guilty or sinful, any more than a man that is healthy is so merely because they feel healthy. And he says, a strong and well-constituted man digests his experiences, his deeds and misdeeds included, as he digests his meals, even when he has to swallow some tough morsels. So we ought to take, in the same way that he's saying here, right, a strong and well-constituted man is going to take into account, yeah, I've done some bad things, I want to learn from them. There are some bad things in the world that it really sucks, and it might make us feel bad, sad, maybe depressed. But there's a difference in taking that and taking it into their experience and learning from it, trying to deal with it, to cope with it, and being unable to deal with it, unable to overcome it. And that is going to be the difference between good and bad and good and evil. And this is what really characterizes bad conscience as a characteristic of the ascetic ideal. That the ascetic ideal says, well, we want to strip away the world because the world is evil. But ultimately, we can't overcome evil. We don't have the power as human beings to overcome evil. Only God does. So we think in terms of value oppositions, in terms of good and evil. And we can't ultimately deal with evil. We have to just have faith that God will. Now, in the same way, the philosopher thinks of that, but in terms of truth, only truth can overcome, ignorance, right? We should think of things not in terms of good and evil, which come from, Nietzsche identifies it most strongly with Christianity, but, religion. We should think of things in terms of good and bad. There are good things and there are bad things, and there are differences, and we can have a hierarchy of certain things that we take to be good, certain things that we take to be bad. But the bad things are part of life. They're not something that is a kind of original sin. We punish people who do bad things, but then after we punish them, then they move on. It's the focus on evil that really motivates the ascetic ideal. Because the ascetic ideal is so pervasive, in fact, it is almost a kind of a natural facet of humanity. This leads Nietzsche to say that man is the sick animal. Because humanity is it's the animal that denies that it's an animal. And the sickness causes suffering, which in turn requires more ascetic self-treatment, according to the one who practices asceticism, right? So the fact that I exist as a human, that I have these urges, it's a kind of sickness which causes me to suffer. So I need to engage more strongly in my asceticism, engage more strongly in ascetic self-treatment. But the problem is that this ascetic self-treatment self-accelerates the sickness. That, he says, even when he wounds himself, this master of destruction, the very wound itself afterward compels him to live. And so we're kind of stuck in this cycle because of the ascetic ideal. That an ascetic life is a self-contradiction because it's a denial of life. That the one who engages in asceticism does so because they are not master over something in life. Because they're not a master over something in life, in the world, they want to become a master over life itself. Only God can do that. A human being, as part of life, cannot become master over life itself. So, what does one who promotes the ascetic ideal do? They deny life itself. That is what asceticism does. They are a will to nothingness. They're not a will to live in the world, to experience greatness, to risk and maybe experience hardship. The ascetic ideal is to basically negate existence, to live a life of nothingness. It's a form of nihilism. It is to say there is nothing, ultimately, that is valuable. Nothing in the world that is valuable. And all that there is the world. Which is why one originally turns to the ascetic ideal because they cannot, handle the fact that there is no objective meaning in the world. I want to read this passage actually from Nietzsche here. So he says, this is precisely what the ascetic ideal means. That something was lacking, that man was surrounded by a fearful void. He did not know how to justify, to account for, to affirm himself. He suffered from the problem of his meaning. He also suffered otherwise. He was in the main a sickly animal. But his problem was not suffering itself, but that there was no answer to the crying question, why do I suffer? The meaninglessness of suffering, not suffering itself, was the curse that lay over mankind so far, and the ascetic ideal offered man meaning. It was the only meaning offered so far. Any meaning is better than none at all. The ascetic ideal was in every sense the faute de mieux, par excellence so far. In it, suffering was interpreted. The tremendous void seemed to have been filled. The door was closed to any kind of suicidal nihilism. This interpretation, there is no doubt of it, brought fresh suffering with it, deeper, more inward, more poisonous, more life-destructive suffering. It placed all suffering under the perspective of guilt. We can no longer conceal from ourselves what is expressed by all that willing which has taken its direction from the ascetic ideal. This hatred of the human, and even more of the animal, and more still of the material, this horror of the senses, of reason itself, this fear of happiness and beauty, this longing to get away from all appearance, change, becoming, death, wishing, from longing itself, all this means, let us dare to grasp it, a will to nothingness, an aversion to life, a rebellion against the most fundamental presuppositions of life. But this is and remains still a will, a phenomenon of life. And to repeat in conclusion what I said at the beginning, man would rather will nothingness than not will. So I want to look at this by considering 6 different moral theories. So these moral theories are in a way an attempt to give some justification for how we ought to live our lives. And in some way they're all a form of the ascetic ideal. Now we might want to take, we'll start off with Mahayana Buddhist ethics. Mahayana Buddhist ethics says, well, everything is impermanent. Because everything is impermanent, there then is no, lasting self. The self is an illusion. If there are no selves, there's no one's individual suffering to privilege over others. So we ought to treat everyone's suffering equally, and therefore treat everyone equally in this way, prioritizing no one over anyone else. Well, we might think that, Nietzsche is saying, the problem is the philosopher can't deal with the fact that, things in the world are impermanent, things are in flux and constant change. And Buddhism says that all things are impermanent. So why would there be an ascetic ideal in this? Well, because the Buddhist says life is suffering. You cannot overcome suffering, at least in this world. You can overcome it only by detaching from all things. And what is attachment but a form of existence? So it is a form of nihilism, Nietzsche would say. What about Kantian deontological ethics, right? We ought to only do that which can be, or we ought to refrain from that which cannot be willed or cannot be turned into a universal will of humanity. I don't really have a comeback in defense of Kantian deontology. It's pretty clear, Nietzsche is very clear in his criticism of Kant. There's nothing that might seem like it is not a form of the ascetic ideal. It completely rejects the body. It says moral value is that which is universal, that which reason prescribes alone. It is almost, the exemplification of the ascetic ideal. What about Scanlonian contractualist ethics, right? We ought to do that which can't be reasonably disagreed with. Well, the emphasis is on reasonableness, right? Scanlon makes sure to say, look, it's not about what one is irrational to disagree with, or we only, do things that are morally justified if people agree that it's, or that it's rational for people to agree that it's justified, right? The emphasis is on reasonableness, and anyone can offer a reasonable rejection. But the problem is, well, one, it's influenced by Kant, but ultimately, because it takes normativity to be the product of impersonal, reasonable agreement. And yet, this isn't so much seen in the Genealogy of Morals, more in some of Nietzsche's other works, but Nietzsche argues consciousness is itself always personal. This idea that there can be some kind of impersonal form of reasonable agreement or then reasonable disagreement, it's a fantasy. It's a rejection of the fact that sometimes we do have personal interests that can't be reasonably justified to others, and that doesn't necessarily mean that we ought not to engage in those things. What about Millian utilitarian ethics? Well, utilitarianism says that we ought to promote that which brings about the greatest happiness or the most amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. There's an emphasis on pleasure. Isn't pleasure, a form of, an aspect of existence, of sensuality? But the problem is that the kind of pleasure utilitarianism speaks of, the kind of happiness it speaks of, is defined from an impersonal perspective, and that is ultimately impossible, right? We can never identify with an impersonal perspective because there is no such thing. All perspectives are, by definition, personal. There is no view from nowhere. Humean sentimentalist ethics is interesting because Hume wants to say, look, we should, in terms of the normative claims, not just the meta-ethical claims, we ought to do that which is, pleasing to ourselves, pleasing to others, useful to ourselves, useful to others, and so on. And we can rely on our sentiments as a judge for whether those our actions are those things or not. And so it might seem that, see, again, there's an emphasis on sentiment, and so it's an acknowledgement of the sensuality of existence. But I think Nietzsche would say that really this account of the different virtues that the sentiments can be seen as being identified with, it really falls into the same problem of the English utilitarian psychologist that Nietzsche criticizes in the introduction to the Genealogy of Morals, that it takes sentimental values to be natural and universal. And so, yeah, it might say we ought to base our ethics on our sentiments, on our feelings, but then what it identifies those feelings or how it makes sense of those feelings, it puts them into certain kinds of virtues that it takes to then be universal. But that would be misguided. That would be an illusion. And then maybe the hardest one is Aristotelian virtue ethics, because, Nietzsche talks about, speaks highly of, in a way, the kind of excellence-centered ethics that, the Greeks and ancient societies emphasize. And it would seem then that, Aristotle, seems to, emphasize excellence. And how as well can it be promoting an ascetic ideal, especially if Nietzsche's equating so much of the ascetic ideal with Christian values when, of course, Aristotle lived prior to Christianity? But I think Nietzsche would still be critical of Aristotle's virtue ethics because the normativity of the virtues expounded are normative only for those who act rationally or lead such a life, that they are the virtues ultimately of the contemplative life, and that's the only life that is valuable ultimately according to Aristotle. And that would be, once again, just another form of the ascetic ideal. What's interesting then is one might think they need to turn away from, if the moral philosophers are unable to escape the kind of religiosity of faith, giving, or having faith in this kind of value of truth over and above the world itself, in the same way that a religious person would have faith in God as someone over and above the world itself. One might then turn to science, and maybe to prescribe our values to make them objective as a reflection of the world, or secularism, or atheism. So we might ask, well, has modern science, which has eliminated God from the picture, displaced the ascetic ideal? And because isn't science the opposite of religion? That, it seeks only that kind of knowledge which can be empirically verified, which then is a reflection of the world itself. But what's interesting is Nietzsche is going to say that science, and secularism and atheism included, science and those other things, they presuppose the value of truth itself. They presuppose, right? Why science pursues the kind of truth it does. It denies to itself that it already is giving value to something without justification. And it must justify it. And it's not that it can't justify it, but the scientist wants to say, no, that kind of truth is valuable in and of itself because it's the truth. And again, what is that than another form of the ascetic ideal? Of, putting faith in something over and above the world itself, this thing that is called, that is truth, that we pursue it for its own sake. Nietzsche says, nothing is more foreign to these men who are unconditional about one thing, these so-called free spirits, right, of the free spirit of the scientists or the secularists or the atheists. Nothing is more foreign to these free spirits than freedom and liberation in this sense. In no respect are they more rigidly bound to the ascetic ideal. It is precisely in their faith in truth as a certain kind of thing that's over and above the world itself, truth, right, in the sense of being transcendent, unconditional, universal, and so on, that they are more rigid and unconditional than anyone. That which constrains these men, however, this unconditional will to truth, is faith in the ascetic ideal itself. Even if, as an unconscious imperative, and don't be deceived about that, it is the faith in a metaphysical value, the absolute value of truth, sanctioned and guaranteed by this ideal alone. It stands or falls with this ideal. Strictly speaking, there is no such thing as science without any presuppositions. A philosophy, a faith, must always be there first of all, right? Because we can ask, well, why do you pursue science? Why are you interested in it? Well, a lot of scientists say because it's useful, because we pursue science because ultimately it's useful. Well, again, that is to say in some ways, to ascribe to it a certain kind of value. But as Nietzsche has tried to argue, values aren't given in the world. They always correspond to some form of life. In some way, right, we pursue it for some kind of justified way in securing our form of existence. So again, let me say, a philosophy, a faith must always be there first of all, so that science can acquire it from a direction, a meaning, a limit, a method, a right to exist. Science itself henceforth requires justification. And that's not to say that, Nietzsche is saying, well, we shouldn't pursue science. Science offers us nothing. No, it's just that the scientist, by saying, well, no, science gives us our values, or, the scientist, isn't involved in faith, or science doesn't rest on faith, or whatever. Nietzsche wants to say, yes, it does. When you take science in that way, when you engage in what is often known as scientism, it is a kind of religious activity. It is a form of asceticism. And it ultimately then is, in the praise of science, an ascetic ideal, a will to nothingness. So we need to rethink about morality, about moral ideals. The question of morality, Nietzsche wants to say, is a question of meaning, because it is meaninglessness that prompts us to engage in moral theorizing and in promoting moral ideals and then ultimately ascetic ideals in the first place. And if we want meaning, then we ought to reject ascetic ideals. Now, we can't have objective transcendent meaning. There is none. But that doesn't mean we can't engage in meaningful lives, create meaning. I mean, the whole kind of existentialist tradition is about trying to think about what exactly does that mean to engage in a meaningful life in a world that is inherently meaningless. And Nietzsche redefines, or wants to redefine, the interests of morality in this way, focusing on meaningfulness as opposed to morality, because he thinks that it's got to reflect life itself. It's got to reflect us as animals, and admitting this to ourselves. We all necessarily see things from a different perspective, right? We are persons. We all have certain perspectives. Now, by seeing things from a different perspective, we ought to see that there is value then in seeing things from as many different perspectives as we can. Because each human being has a different perspective as how they view the world. Now, this doesn't mean that we see things from an abstract, disinterested, or impersonal perspective. And it doesn't mean that, we say, well, all perspectives are equal. But, and this is what is known as perspectivism, Nietzsche thinks that philosophers should reject the will to truth and instead strive to understand the world from as many different perspectives as possible. So he says, henceforth, my dear philosophers, let us be on guard against the dangerous old conceptual fiction that posited a pure, will-less, painless, timeless, knowing subject. Let us guard against the snares of such contradictory concepts as pure reason, absolute spirituality, knowledge in itself. These always demand that we should think of an I that is completely unthinkable, an I turned in no particular direction, in which the active and interpreting forces through which alone seeing becomes something are supposed to be lacking. These always demand of the I an absurdity and a nonsense. There is only a perspective seeing, only a perspective knowing. And the more affects we allow to speak about one thing, the more eyes, different eyes, we can use to observe one thing. The complete will, our concept of this thing, our objectivity be. But to eliminate the will altogether, to suspend each and every affect, supposing we were capable of this, what would that mean but to castrate the intellect? So instead of a will to truth, right, we ought to engage in perspectivism. We ought to admit that there are different perspectives from which we see the world and make sense of the world. What then is Nietzsche advocating? Well, this is what's difficult. He's not offering some kind of normative ideal in the way that all other moral philosophers offer normative ideals and say, well, ultimately, this principle is normatively binding or something like that. Because there are no normatively binding principles in the sense that, well, what is normatively binding is that which is universal, rational, and so on. And so Nietzsche is saying, well, look, if it's impossible but to see the world, but to make sense of the world from a different perspective, to basically interpret the world, if all is interpretation, then we ought to engage in value pluralism, right? That there are a multiplicity of values that are not necessarily all equal. We can say that some are better, some are worse, but which are irreducible to any one value: economic, aesthetic, moral, political, cultural, and so on. There are all these different kinds of values. But we can't all say, well, ultimately what gives meaning to existence is, the value of money, or the value of beauty, or the value of the good, or in a specific interpretation of the good, and things like that. In different contexts, we might say, well, the economic values are more well, valuable here are the principles, right? We ought to follow those, but they can't be all reducible to one because they correspond to life, and life is nuanced. Life is complex. It's up for individuals themselves to figure out what kinds of values then motivate, orient their lives. So in place of morality, we should strive for pluralistic practices of living and aesthetics, in a sense, of life. And if we are really interested in, let's say, the Christian values of, loving everyone equally, so in that sense of equality, I think what's really interesting here in what Nietzsche is saying is, well, must equality, to say every perspective is a perspective worth considering, is that the same as sameness, as thinking of equality in the sense of sameness? Because maybe the problem with that approach to thinking about moral equality is to say, well, everybody's the same. There is no difference. But what if we said instead, well, there are differences, and we ought to consider all of those differences because they are differences, and to decide which are more important and lesser important, but that each is to be considered? Is that a more valuable form of maybe equality? I thought a really interesting discussion question would be that, so the problem Nietzsche ultimately identifies with moralism is inherent even in things that are opposed to moralism. So even science we've seen as a kind of moralism. We see even in the capitalistic ethic, the drive to maximize profit for the sake of profit is also a kind of moralism. We see this in the famous Max Weber's book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, where ultimately that drive to maximize profit for the sake of profit is a kind of will to nothingness, a kind of nihilism. We see that even the elimination of suffering is a kind of moralism, because we can't overcome suffering, thinking of it as the basis of existence. So there are all these different kinds that we might think aren't a kind of moralism, that are a kind of moralism, that engage in ascetic ideals, that ultimately are nihilistic. But I think what's interesting to think about is whether these might be two different ways to think about it, but whether it's psychologically possible to live pluralistically, to not reduce all values to one, to not engage then in a kind of ascetic ideal of taking one value over and above everything else, and whether it's normatively possible. When we ultimately try to justify things to ourselves, must we do so by reducing all value to one kind of value we take to be most important, we take to be fundamental, universal? Or can we almost kind of detach ourselves from that in these different kind of practices? Is it part of the will or the drive of what it means to be a human to, in this sense, then idealize and uphold one set of values over others? So, in other words, I'm asking, is the kind of value pluralism that Nietzsche advocates, is it actually possible? Or are humans necessarily pathological, inescapably pathological?